Boats as living beings in the Viking world. You picture the Viking Age, which stretched roughly from the late 8th century to the early 11th. The image that comes to mind is usually one of restless energy, sails swelling with the wind, dragon-headed, ships gliding through mist, warriors in fur cloaks stepping onto foreign shores. But for the average Norseman, especially in coastal settlements across Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden, the rhythm of life was not constant raiding or exploration. It was fishing. Fishing, after all, was not glamorous, but it was survival. A Viking might go months without ever drawing a sword, but he could not go more than a day without food. And for communities living on the edge of harsh northern seas, fish cod, herring, had acquired the real wealth. Every boat that slipped into the waves was not just a vessel. It was the fragile line between hunger and security. It is here that we begin to notice something unusual about Viking culture. They often treated boats less as tools and more as companions. Boats were named, spoken to, decorated, and sometimes even buried as if they were people. And in certain fishing communities, men sang to them quiet songs, patterned chants, and, yes, what can only be described as lullabies. Why lullabies? To understand, you need to picture the Viking worldview. The soul in the wood, the Norse, had a way of seeing the world that blurred the boundary between object and spirit. They believed that almost anything could possess a Vidura spirit, a presence, a kind of soul. Stones had it, mountains had it, trees certainly were alive with it, and wood, once cut from the tree, did not lose its essence. A plank or beam carried something of the tree's former life, its stubbornness against wind, its patient soaking of rain, its twisting against storms. When a boat builder shaped oak or pine into the curved ribs of a ship, he was not simply crafting lumber, he was coaxing the spirit of the tree into a new role. And when a fisherman set out to sea in that boat, he did not sit in an inanimate machine. He sat in a living being that had its own mood and needed to be cared for. That is why Vikings gave boats names, not just grand warships like Ormren, Longi, the Long Serpent, but also small fishing vessels. Naming was a way of acknowledging personality. Some were called after animals' Ravensseal, Oxwile. Others carried names that hinted at protection, like Safe Haven or Sea Friend. And what do you do for a companion? You speak to it, calm it. You sing to it the songs of the rowers. Of course, singing in boats was not unique to Vikings. Across the world, sailors have always used song as a rhythm for rowing or hauling. On Viking longships, war crews sang rowing songs that kept oars striking the water in unison. These were not lullabies They were driving chants, built on steady beats to maximize power. But in the quieter world of fishing, the tone shifted. You didn't need to row furiously to the beat of drums. Instead, you needed endurance, patience, and sometimes silence. When you cast nets in still water at dawn, the last thing you wanted was loud shouting. And so the fishermen developed songs that were softer, repetitive, and strangely soothing. The melody might repeat a simple pattern of 2 or 3 notes. The lyrics were often plain statements, mentions of the sea, the fish, the safety of home. But occasionally, the words were directed not to the crew or to the gods, but to the boat itself. Sleep, little keel, while we drift. Rock gently. Haul, the nets are waiting. These are not direct translations, but reconstructions of the kind of phrases found in sagas and oral fragments. Scholars debate whether to call them lullabies, but that is essentially how they functioned. Quiet songs of reassurance, as if to say both to the boat and to the men within it that everything would hold together until morning. The harshness of the sea to fully appreciate why such songs mattered. You need to imagine the danger of the waters. The North Atlantic is no gentle sea. Off the coast of Norway, sudden squalls could whip up without warning. In Iceland, fog rolled in so thick that a fisherman might lose sight of the shore within minutes. A leaky boat, a snapped oar, or a shift in the wind could mean death. And so the boat itself became almost like another crew member, one whose cooperation was vital. If the planks swelled with water, if the seams split, if the keel cracked, all was lost. Singing to the boat was not merely superstition. It was a way of acknowledging dependence. You sang to your boat because you needed it to stay strong. The lullaby was half ritual, half psychology. It calmed the men singing in rhythm, slows the breath, softens fear, and makes time pass more easily. It also paid respect to the spirit of the vessel, keeping it metaphorically asleep, so it would not betray its passengers with sudden restlessness. From hearth to sea there is another reason Viking fishermen may have sung lullabies. It echoed the songs of the home. In longhouses across Scandinavia, women sang to children at night. The Norse lullabies we know of today are fragment simple. Rocking tunes meant to settle babies against the roar of wind outside. Some invoke elves or household spirits, asking them to keep the child safe until morning. When men went to sea, often for days, they carried those rhythms in memory. Alone in the vastness of the waves, rocking in wooden boats that creaked like cradles, they naturally borrowed the same kind of melodies. The sea was a place of danger, but also of rocking, lulling motion. To sing a boat to sleep was to treat it like a child, fragile and in need of comfort. And perhaps, unconsciously, the fishermen were singing to themselves as well. Fragments in the sagas of these songs survives in only the faintest traces. The sagas, written centuries later in Iceland, are more interested in blood feuds, kings, and heroic voyages than in fishermen. But here and there, in side passages, you find mention of men singing over their boats or whispering verses into the wind before casting nets. One Icelandic anecdote, recorded in the 14th century, but likely older, tells of a fisherman who always hummed to his boat before setting sail. Neighbors teased him until one stormy day his vessel returned safely, when others did not. After that, the habit spread, whether legend or not. The story captures something essential. Songs were thought to have protective power, just as charms and runes were carved into wood. So too words, spoken aloud, could shape fate. The rhythm of boredom. It's important not to imagine these songs as rare, mystical ceremonies. More likely, they were woven into the boredom of long hours. Picture it: 3 men in a narrow boat, lines cast, silence stretching. The only sounds are the slap of waves and the occasional seabird. To pass the time, one begins a tune. The others hum along, not loudly, but enough to keep the boat alive with sound. The words might not matter much. They could be improvised, silly, even repetitive to the point of nonsense. What mattered was the effect, a rhythm to keep men awake, calm, and bound together as the hours drifted. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, low voices humming in unison like the sea itself breathing. A question left open, so we return to the image of Viking fishermen, not as warriors or explorers, but as tired men, rocking gently on gray waves, whispering lullabies to the planks beneath them. To some, it may seem childish, but to the Norse, who believed wood had memory, who trusted boats more than kings, and who measured survival not in glory, but in codfish, it made perfect sense. And yet a question lingers. Were these songs truly for the boats, or were they, in the end, for the men themselves, fragile humans pretending that wood and sea could be soothed like restless children? Songs, spirits, and the rituals of the scene, the first part of this story. We explored the everyday practice of Viking fishermen singing to their boat soft, rhythmic songs that soothed both vessel and crew. We looked at the worldview that allowed such practices to emerge, the Norse sense that objects, especially wood and stone, carried spirits, the precarious dangers of the North Atlantic that demanded respect for boats as partners in survival, and the ways lullabies might echo the household, songs of longhouses. But these small fragments of daily life cannot be fully understood without placing them within the larger fabric of Norse ritual and religion. For the Vikings, the act of singing was never just entertainment. Songs were bridges between humans and gods, between men and nature, and between safety and catastrophe. To sing to a boat was, in many ways, to offer it a prayer. The sea, as a living force, the Norse did not think of the sea as a neutral backdrop. The sea was a power, a personality, something you negotiated with each time you pushed your boat into the surf. In Old Norse, the word for sea crees, often accompanied by epithets like mighty, cold, ravenous, in kennings, those poetic riddles beloved by skalds. The sea was described as the whale road, the swan's riding ground, the path of oars. Each phrase reflects not only the physical reality of water, but its mythic presence. If the sea was alive, then a boat was the mediator between man and wave. Singing to the boat was a way of aligning yourself with the forces around you, as if telling the vessel, "You are my shield against this mighty being. Hold steady." This aligns with another practice well attested in Norse life: the offering of small rituals before sailing. Fishermen might place a piece of bread or fish on the shore as an offering to sea spirits. Others carved runes into the prow or painted eyes on the front of boats so the vessel could see and guide itself. In this light, lullabies become part of the same protective arsenal quiet rituals that acknowledged the perilous contract between man, wood, and water. The overlap of work, song, and spell, the Norse made little distinction between what we might call a song and what we might call a spell. Words had power. A skald could insult a man with unverses that cut reputations to pieces. Warriors carried charms in the form of battle chants. Farmers recited verses to bless their crops. For fishermen, a lullaby could therefore be both a work song and a magical act. The rhythm helped keep boredom at bay, but the words also invoked safety. In fact, the sagas sometimes describe men as singing runes over objects, suggesting that melody was part of activating magic. We don't know the exact words Viking fishermen used, but if we imagine, they might have sounded something like this: "Steady keel, hold me still, guide me home through fog and hill. Wood of oak, hear my song, keep me safe the whole night long." Such verses blend prayer and lullaby, ordinary reassurance and supernatural petition. The gods of the sea when Norsemen thought of the sea. They thought not only of impersonal spirits, but also of gods. Chief among these was Ingerd, the Vanir god, of the sea, wealth, and fishing. Ingerd was considered a patron of prosperity, invoked when setting nets or launching boats. His blessings were said to bring calm winds and full catches. It is not hard to imagine that some lullabies sung to boats carried an undercurrent of prayer to endured, lines that slipped his name between the rhythms of rowing or casting. If a fisherman whispered a melody to the planks of his vessel, he might be addressing both the spirit of the wood and the god who controlled the waters around it. There was also Ran, the fearsome sea goddess who drowned men and hoarded their treasures in her net. While Nijerd was associated with bounty, Ran represented danger. Songs could be a way of appeasing her, of asking that she not pull the boat under. To sing was to bargain. Let this vessel sleep. Ran let it drift safely beyond your grasp. Every day, rituals at sea, the more we examine the practice of singing, the more it appears as one piece of a larger web of daily rituals. Archaeological finds and later accounts suggest that Viking sailors were highly ritualistic. They avoided certain words at sea, fearing they might anger the waves. They never whistled on board, believing it would summon storms. They spat over the side to appease the spirits of the water. Songs then were not anomalies. They were part of a set of habits that blended superstition, tradition, and survival. The lullaby was the gentlest of these, while some rituals were stern taboos. This one was soothing, almost affectionate. Imagine, then, a fisherman in Iceland around the year 950. He has rowed out with 2 companions in a small 6-oared boat. The air is damp, the water restless. They have dropped their nets and now wait. The boat sways. To keep calm, he begins to hum, then sing. His voice is not strong yet, is tired, quiet, but steady. His companions join, each taking a line. The sound rises over the water, not loud enough to scare fish, but enough to fill the space between them. For a few minutes, fear recedes. The boat feels less like a fragile shell of planks and more like a living partner, rocking in rhythm with their song. Songs as memory keepers. Another layer to consider is memory. The Viking world was oral. Stories, genealogies, laws, even spells, all were preserved by memory and song. The lullabies, 2 boats, may also have been ways of transmitting knowledge. Perhaps one verse reminded fishermen of a safe route between islands. Another might encode the order of net setting or the timing of tides. By embedding practical details in verse, men could remember without writing. And because songs were passed from father to son, they became cultural anchors. This is why, even if we lack surviving texts, echoes of such songs likely lingered in the background of later sagas. The words may have faded, but the habit of blending song, magic, and memory was deeply ingrained in Norse culture, echoes in later traditions. We might wonder whether the Viking fishermen's lullabies disappeared when the Viking Age ended. But maritime traditions have a way of persisting. In Iceland, well into the 19th century, fishermen were still known to sing quiet verses at sea. In Norway, lullabies for boats blended into a broader tradition of cave-eating folk singing that included work songs for nearly every task. Even in Scotland's Hebrides, where Norse influence was strong, crofters sang walking songs to rhythmically full cloth, and fishermen sang low airs when rowing. Some Gaelic fishing songs seem remarkably similar to what the sagas hint at, half practical, half prayerful, with refrains that soothe as much as they instruct. These survivals suggest that the Viking lullabies were not isolated quirks, but part of a widespread northern custom, using song to tame the sea and pass the hours of waiting. An image to carry forward. So, when we think of Viking fishermen, it helps to replace the usual picture of roaring raiders with a quieter one. Picture 3, or for men in a narrow boat, huddled against the chill. They are not fierce warriors at this moment, but ordinary people, worried fathers, tired sons, hopeful brothers, singing to wood and water. Their voices are low, almost like murmured prayers. The lullaby drifts across the gray sea, carried on waves that do not answer. And yet, in the act of singing, there is a kind of answer. The boat holds, the nets stretch, men wait. For another hour, perhaps, the sea is patient. An open question. We can see how lullabies, two boats, fit into Norse religion, superstition, and daily ritual. But we are left to wonder, did the men truly believe the boat listened, or did they only pretend for comfort's sake? Were these songs prayers to spirits, or were they simply a way for fragile humans to soothe their own restless minds under endless skies? Boats, burials, and the afterlife of Songwi have followed Viking fishermen into the gray waters of the North Atlantic, listening as they hummed and sang soft verses to their fragile wooden vessels. We've seen how these lullabies were rooted in a Norse worldview that blurred the line between tool and companion, between object and spirit. We have explored how songs doubled as rituals, half prayer and half work song, soothing both the boat and the men within it. But the story does not end on the open sea. To understand the full place of these songs in Viking life, we must return to land, specifically to the way boats lived and died, and how songs carried them beyond. Boats as companions in life and death. Archaeology tells us what texts do not. Boats were among the most honored objects in the Viking world. The most famous graves of the Viking Age are not just burials of kings and chieftains, but of boats themselves. At Oseberg in Norway, a magnificent ship carved with curling designs was used as the burial chamber for two high-ranking women around. The year 834, at Gokstad, another ship held the remains of a wealthy man. Surrounded by animals, weapons, and tools. In smaller graves too, fragments of boats appear, suggesting that even ordinary people sometimes entered the afterlife by way of a vessel. What does this tell us? Simply that boats were more than machines. They were partners, honored companions. If a warrior could be buried with his sword, a sailor might be buried with his boat. And if boats could accompany humans into the afterlife, then surely they could also be soothed, protected, even sung to during life. The lullaby, as farewell imagined, then a fisherman's final journey. Perhaps his small boat had carried him for decades through storms and calms alike. When he died, his community might not have had the resources to bury him in a great ship mound like Oseberg, but they could still honor the bond. Some burials used small boats cut down into coffins. Others placed boat-shaped stones around the grave, creating an outline of a vessel to carry the soul. It is not impossible to picture the mourners singing at such burials soft songs that resembled the very lullabies the fisherman once sang to. His boat, in death as in life, the vessel remained a cradle, rocking the soul from one world to another. This blending of lullaby and farewell is deeply human. Around the world, we find cultures where songs soothe both infants and the dying. For the Vikings, whose lives were so bound to boats, it is natural that the same melodies used at sea might also echo in funerals. The symbolic sleep of ships, the idea of singing a boat to sleep, takes on a deeper resonance when we consider how Vikings thought about death. To them, death was often described as a kind of rest, a sleep before another journey. Graves were filled with tools, food, and clothes so that the dead could continue their travels in the afterlife. A boat, too, might sleep when it was no longer seaworthy. Some old vessels were pulled onto land and left to decay, grass growing between their ribs. In Icelandic poetry, such abandoned boats are described in almost human terms, resting, slumbering, or waiting. If you had spent years singing lullabies to your boat, seeing it as a companion, perhaps letting it sleep on land was not neglect, but a final kindness. The boat had earned its rest. Songs as a thread of memory, we must remember that the Viking world was oral. Very few written texts exist from the period itself. Instead, memory was carried through voice, through sagas, chants, and songs. A lullaby, sung to a boat, may never have been written down, but it lived in the mouths of fishermen, passed from one generation to the next. Even if the words shifted, the act remained. When you pushed a boat into the water, you sang. When you drifted on calm seas, you hummed. When storms threatened, you murmured charms. In this way, song became the thread that tied together generations of seafarers. We sometimes think of Vikings as driven by glory, fame, or conquest, but survival required something quieter, the ability to endure long hours, to trust fragile wood, to wait for fish. In that waiting, song became the glue of culture, echoes in the sagas and beyond. By the time the sagas were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, Christianity had long since swept across Scandinavia. Pagan practices had been softened, reframed, or forgotten. When a saga mentions a man singing over his boat, or when a skald describes a ship lulled by waves, we hear faint echoes of those lullabies. Later folklore in Iceland and Norway preserves similar habits. Fishermen whispered verses before sailing, sometimes mixing Christian prayers with older patterns. Even today, you can find traditional Norwegian folk songs that treat boats as companions, not tool songs about vessels that are tired, sleeping, or dreaming. The persistence of these motifs across centuries suggests that the Viking lullabies were never entirely lost. They simply adapted, merging with new faiths and customs, yet always retaining their core purpose: to soothe fragile hearts in the face of a vast, indifferent sea. A meditation on fragility. When we step back, what strikes us most is the fragility of it all. The Vikings are often cast as bold, invincible figures, yet here we see them at their most human. Picture, again, that tiny fishing boat bobbing on a sea that could swallow it whole. Picture the men inside, voices low, as if speaking to a child. This is not arrogance, it is humility. To sing a lullaby to a boat is to admit that you are small, that your life depends on planks of wood and invisible currents. It is to admit fear and to soothe it with song. Perhaps that is why these lullabies mattered so much. They gave men a way to face the immensity of the sea without despair. They created a fragile but real sense of companionship. The boat is with us. It will not betray us. It too is soothed by song. The broader lesson: what can we take from these forgotten lullabies today? Maybe it is the reminder that even the most practical tasks, fishing, rowing, sailing, are never purely mechanical. Humans always weave meaning into their tools. We name our cars, we talk to our computers, we pat the side of airplanes before boarding. The Viking fishermen did the same with their boats, but they took it one step further. They sang. In doing so, they left behind a lesson in humility and tenderness. Even in a harsh world, even among a people often remembered only for violence. There was room for soft voices, quiet songs, and the recognition that survival sometimes depends not on strength, but on gentleness. Closing reflection. So, the next time you picture Vikings, do not imagine only the clash of swords or the roar of raids. Imagine also the silence of dawn, the rocking of a small boat, and the murmur of lullabies drifting over cold water. Imagine men treating wood as a child, singing it to sleep so that they themselves might sleep in safety once more. And consider this unresolved question: when those lullabies vanished into the air, did they fade entirely, or do they still echo softly, faintly across the waters where Viking boats once rocked, as if the sea itself remembers the songs sung to it? Moss, mountains, and murmured songs. If you picture the landscape of Wales, you might imagine rolling green hills, misty valleys, and sheep scattered across rocky slopes. The image is not wrong, but it leaves something out: moss. In Wales, it clings to stones, carpets, walls, softens trees, and lines riverbanks with a green so deep it almost seems to glow. In the 19th century, when most Welsh shepherds spent their lives outdoors, moss was not just background scenery. It was a companion, a presence, something you noticed when you had little else for company on a wet hillside. And, curiously, it was something you sang to. A landscape of quiet companions shepherding in Wales was rarely glamorous. It meant long hours of solitude, following flocks up into the uplands and down again, in rain more often than in sunshine. Sheep rarely provided much conversation, and though dogs were loyal, even they could not fill every silence. What did a shepherd do then? With all those hours, he noticed things. He studied the shapes of clouds, the way lichen crept over rocks, the sounds of streams, the moods of the wind. And among these, he saw moss. Moss was always there, soft underfoot, damp to the touch, holding rain like a sponge. It covered ruined cottages, turning walls into green pillows. It filled old wells, making them look like velvet. It softened the edges of stones that had once been sharp. To a lonely shepherd, moss was a constant, silent, patient, enduring. Moss in Welsh folklore, in Welsh tradition, moss was more than a plant. It was sometimes described as a healer, sometimes as a guardian. Folk remedies included moss poultices for wounds, or moss stuffed into shoes to ease blisters. Moss also lined cradles to make them soft and warm, a kind of natural padding for infants, because moss was seen as gentle and protective. It slipped into stories and songs. There were lullabies that compared a child's bed to Muzagal, soft. Moss. There were proverbs that spoke of moss as a sign of patience. The moss does not rush, but still it covers the stone. For shepherds who lived closest to the landscape, moss may have felt almost alive, almost listening. And if something listens, it invites song. Why sing to moss? Here we come to the curious detail that has puzzled more than one folklorist accounts. From the 19th century described shepherds in parts of rural Wales singing softly to moss. The songs were not elaborate. They were often wordless, humming, or simple verses repeated again and again. Sometimes they borrowed lines from old lullabies, replacing child with moss. Why? Several possibilities arise. For company, singing gave voice to solitude. The moss was a convenient audience, a listener who never argued, never left Dot as a charm. Moss was linked to healing and softness. Singing to it may have been a way of asking for its protective qualities for the flock or for oneself, as a metaphor comparing sheep to moss was common. Both spread slowly across hillsides. Both grew in quiet persistence. A shepherd singing to moss might really be singing to his flock as a lullaby, just as Viking fishermen soothed their boats. Welsh shepherds soothed their sheep. A gentle voice calmed animals. If moss symbolized softness, then songs directed at moss might in practice be intended to quiet the flock. Whatever the reason, the practice reveals something tender. Men living in hard conditions, alone on windswept hills, still found time to sing to plants, to stones, to silence itself. The sound of the hills, what would such singing have sounded like? We cannot know exactly, but we can guess. Traditional Welsh folk singing is rich in minor tones, full of lilting rises and falls. Many melodies are slow, with drawn-out vowels suited to echoing in valleys. Shepherds likely adapted this style into something simpler, a tune that could be carried on a whistle or hummed under the breath. Imagine standing on a damp hillside in Carmarthenshire in 1845. You hear sheep bleating, wind pushing across grass, perhaps the faint trickle of a stream. Then, weaving through it, you hear a voice, low, steady, repeating a line. Musago, musago, cad fuyan gins. Moss, moss, keep me warm. Not a grand song, not a performance, just a murmur into the mist. A song from moss and no one else. Songs. As a shepherd's tool, we should not dismiss this singing as mere whimsy. For shepherd's voice was one of the few tools always at hand. They used it to call sheep, to command dogs, to communicate across valleys. Singing was simply another extension of this, an adaptable tool that served both practical and emotional needs. Some folklorists have suggested that singing to moss was a way of marking time. A shepherd could hum through a familiar tune to measure the passing of minutes, much as sailors sang shanties to keep rhythm. Others argue it was a way of easing the sense of damp and cold if you cannot make yourself dry. You can at least make the dampness feel friendlier by singing to the moss that embodies it, whatever the logic. The habit seems to have been surprisingly widespread in certain Welsh valleys, enough to be remarked upon by travelers and noted in local journals. An unexpected form of poetry, though most shepherds were not literate. Wales in the 19th century was famous for its love of poetry. The tradition of the Eisteddfod, a festival of verse, stretched back centuries. Even farmers and herdsmen often composed little poems, exchanging them at taverns or fairs. Singing to moss may have been part of this poetic impulse. It turned the ordinary into the lyrical. A damp stone wall became a subject for song. A patch of green growth became an audience. In a culture where poetry was admired, even the most isolated shepherd might feel moved to create singing not to people, but to moss, a culture of tenderness in hard lives. It is easy to romanticize shepherding, to picture men striding proudly across hills. The truth was harsher. Poverty, damp clothes, loneliness, and often hunger. Yet, in the middle of this hardness, tenderness appeared in songs to moss, in lullabies for sheep, in gentle murmurs that turned silence into music. This tenderness reminds us that human beings rarely let their surroundings stay silent. We fill them with voice, with meaning. Moss did not ask to be sung to, yet it received songs, and in doing so became a partner in shepherds' lives. So we begin with a curious image: a Welsh shepherd in the 1800s, rain dripping from his hat, sheep scattering before him, leaning on his stick, and softly singing to a patch of moss on a stone wall. He does not expect a reply. The moss is not a child, nor a friend, nor a god. Yet still he sings. Perhaps he is not really singing to the moss at all. Perhaps he is singing to himself, using the moss as a mirror. Or perhaps, in some way, lost to us now, he truly believed. The moss listened, and that his voice mattered to it. Either way, the song lingers, echoing in the damp hillsides of history and echo of human need for connection. However unlikely the listener, the moss songs and the memory of the Hillsif Section 1 showed us the image of a shepherd singing to moss. Section 2 carries us deeper into the kinds of songs that might have been sung, the folklore they touched upon, and how moss carried meanings. Beyond the hillsides of Wales, what did these songs sound like? No written scores survive of moss songs. These were not pieces a bard would perform at an iced fode, nor hymns recorded in chapel hymnals. They lived only in voice, in memory, and in mist. But folklorists who recorded the habits of shepherds in rural Wales gave hints, wordless humming. Much of the singing was described as humming or chanting long, droning notes that seemed to blend with the wind, borrowed lullabies. Some shepherds simply repurposed children's lullabies, replacing words like child with moss or sheep, improvised verses. A shepherd might sing to the rhythm of his walking stick, tapping stones, improvising little rhymes. Musical, A-R-Y, Greg, musical in Typhal, Cadwy, Phi in gay, Pal, Mion Wallabito, moss on the rock, moss that grows, keep my feet warm when it is wet again. Simple, almost childlike, but that simplicity was part of the charm. The songs were not meant for performance, but for endurance. Moss, as listener and witness to, understand. Why moss became the subject of songs? We should consider the role of landscape in Welsh imagination. In Wales, mountains and valleys were never mere scenery. They were characters, companions, and sometimes judges. There was a belief, faint but present, that the land remembered. Stones held history, rivers whispered of the past, and moss, in its quiet persistence, seemed a witness to time. Shepherds who walked the same paths their fathers and grandfathers had walked may have felt that moss remembered them. To dot singing to moss, then, was not only about easing loneliness, was also a way of speaking to memory itself, of making sure one's life was noticed by something that endured. Peeling moss in shepherd remedies the practical uses of moss fed into its symbolism. In 19th century Wales, moss was collected for shoes stuffed inside boots to cushion blisters and absorb damp. Wounds, dried sphagnum moss, in particular, was prized for its absorbency and slight antiseptic quality. Cradles packed under, blankets to soften infants' bedding, insulation pushed into the gaps of cottages to block drafts. A shepherd singing to moss was, in a sense, singing to a healer. Moss kept him dry, healed his cuts, softened his shoes, warmed his house. When you depend on something so often, it ceases to be just a plant. It becomes a companion. Echoes of ancient beliefs, though 19th century shepherds were good chapel-goers. Fragments of older pre-Christian traditions often lingered in folk practice. In Celtic belief, green things, ferns, ivy, moss, were associated with the spirit of the land. With quiet endurance and protection, moss, in particular, was linked to. The in-between, it grew in damp, shaded places, halfway between water and soil, between life and decay. Singing to moss may have been an unconscious echo of an older practice, speaking to the spirits of in-between places, asking for safe passage.com, weather or protection for the flock. It is striking that while shepherds may not have been aware of these echoes, their songs carried a kind of continuity modern lullabies layered upon ancient whispers, moss songs as a form of prayer for many Welsh shepherds. Chapel life was central. Hymns filled their Sundays, and many men knew dozens of verses by heart. To sing to moss might not have seemed irreligious, it might even have been understood as a kind of humble prayer. The rhythm of moss songs often mirrored hymn singing, long-drawn notes, a slow rise and fall, repetition that lulled both singer and sheep. Perhaps a shepherd believed God would hear him even in such a song, carried across moss and stone as easily as across chapel rafters. In this sense, moss songs belonged to a spectrum of devotion, not grand hymns, not formal psalms, but small, private prayers muttered into mist. Travelers who noticed the practice, one of the reasons we know about moss songs at all is that travelers noticed them. During the 1800s, English and continental visitors toured Wales, seeking picturesque landscapes. They recorded the oddities of local life in diaries and letters. In one 1837 account, a traveler in Breconshire wrote, "We came upon a shepherd quite alone, seated upon a stone. He was singing softly to the moss upon the wall, and his dog lay listening. It struck me that the Welsh possess a curious fondness for addressing nature as though it were a child." Another, in 1849, noted the shepherds hum to the moss as a mother hums to a babe. They do not sing loudly, but with patience, repeating the same line endlessly, as if the moss would only understand by much repetition. Such notes were brief, but they confirmed that the habit was not invented later. It was a genuine part of rural life, quietly woven into the hillsides. The sheep's perspective. If sheep could speak, perhaps they would have approved. Shepherds were not only singing to moss for themselves, they were also calming their flocks. Animals respond to rhythm and tone. A low, steady voice reassures. In some valleys, there was even a saying, "If you would keep sheep still, sing to the moss, not to the sky," meaning keep your voice low, humble, grounded, as if singing to something at your feet. Lofty shouts might scatter sheep. Moss songs kept them settled. In this way, the moss acted as a stand-in, a gentle presence that absorbed the song. While the true listeners, the sheep, grew quiet around it. Poetry of the everyday. We must pause to admire the poetry hidden in such habits. A man, his cloak wet, his stick tapping. His sheep, restless, finds himself singing not to people, nor to heaven, nor even to animals, but to moss. It is the sort of poetry that never reaches a stage, but lingers in the folds of daily life. In a land that loved verse, this poetry of the everyday mattered. It taught that beauty could be found in small acts, in songs no one heard, in green cushions on stone walls. The shepherd's moss song was not celebrated, but it was lived. From moss songs to local memory by the late 19th century, as industrialization reached Wales, shepherding declined. Many families left hillsides for coal towns. The songs faded. Yet, in certain valleys, old men remembered them. A folklorist collecting lullabies was told by a farmer's wife. My father sang to the moss when he minded sheep. He said it kept the weather soft. He would hum to it as if it were a friend. Such memories preserved the practice, even when the songs themselves were lost. Today, moss still grows thick across Welsh hills, but no shepherd hums to it. The memory, however, endures in scraps of folklore, waiting quietly like moss itself. The moss songs remind us that human beings are endlessly inventive in finding listeners. When no one else is near, we turn to plants, stones, animals, or the air itself. We do not stay silent for long. A Welsh shepherd's song to moss was never recorded in music books, never performed on stages. Yet it was real. It was lived, hummed, into damp hillsides, mingling with mist and sheep calls. It was both practical and poetic, prayerful and playful, ordinary and extraordinary, and so. When we imagine 19th century Wales, we might picture not only chapels and choirs, but also lone shepherds, their voices blending with the rain, offering lullabies to moss. Moss as a companion by the 19th century. Welsh shepherds were not only caretakers of sheep, but caretakers of the land itself. The moss that spread across stone walls, damp hillsides, and ancient churchyards was not ignored. It was noticed, spoken to, and in some valleys, even sung to. Why? Because moss seemed alive in a way other plants did not. It crept silently, grew slowly, and softened every surface it touched. For men who spend endless days in solitude, moss became a listener in shepherds' journals and scattered folk accounts. Moss was described almost as a quiet pet, faithful, green, and never leaving. Singing to moss was a way to break the silence of the hills. The shepherd might lean against a lichen-coated wall, whistle a low tune, and address the moss as if it could nod in reply. Songs of weather and waiting, the songs themselves were not elaborate. Shepherds rarely had instruments. Their flutes or fiddles were luxuries. Most songs were simple humming, a rising and falling of the voice that echoed faintly across the valley. Some songs described weather, a line for drizzle settling into wool, a hum for fog rolling in from the sea, a verse for sunshine so brief it felt like a trick. And moss was tied to weather more than anything else. Moss thickened in wet years, browned in drought, brightened after mists. Shepherds noticed P. They took moss as their forecast, their silent barometer. Singing to moss was not entirely whimsical, it was practical. Grow well, and we know rain will be kind. One verse recorded in North Wales says, "It was a way of reading nature, but also of talking back to it. A shepherd's loneliness, the hills of Wales are beautiful, but they are also isolating." Shepherds in the 1800s could spend entire days without seeing another person. Their only company, sheep, dogs, and the endless green slopes. Loneliness makes companions out of anything stone, stream, or moss. Singing to moss became a kind of conversation, not because moss answered, but because silence felt heavier than words. One diary entry from 1836 recalls, "I sang to the wall as I tended my flock, for the moss is a gentler friend than most men in town." It simply received the sound and kept growing. The ritual of evenings were the most common time for moss songs. As sheep settled and daylight faded, shepherds leaned against stone walls, humming softly. Moss walls in Wales, often centuries old, became places where generations of shepherds repeated the same habit, pressing their backs to stone, watching the hills turn blue and letting a tune drift out. Some claimed moss grew better on sung-to walls. Children repeated this, turning it into a superstition. If you want your stone wall to last, sing to its moss. Whether moss truly flourished under song is beside the point. What mattered was the ritual. It gave meaning to the endless sameness of shepherding life. Moss, as memory moss, also carried memory. It grew on gravestones, often obscuring names, but never erasing them entirely. Shepherds passing through churchyards sang to moss there too, as if coaxing it to be gentle with the dead. A slow tune hummed in a graveyard was not so different from a lullaby. Only now the moss was the blanket covering ancestors. In this way, songs to moss became songs to time itself. Singing was a way to acknowledge how short human life is compared to the patient green creep of moss. Moss endured centuries. Shepherds endured decades. One lent its surface to the other, and song bridged the gap, a vanishing practice by the late 19th century. As industrialization spread through Wales, the practice of singing to moss began to fade. Younger generations moved to mines, factories, or cities. The solitude of the hills became less familiar, and with it, the quiet habit of humming to moss walls was lost. Yet echoes remained. Folk collectors in the early 20th century noted green. Songs in rural parts of Wales, slow melodies said to be for the fields and the walls. Some were lullabies adapted for children, carrying forward fragments of the shepherd's moss songs in old villages today. You can still find moss-covered stone walls standing where shepherds once leaned. If you walk there at dusk and hum softly, it feels almost as though you are continuing an ancient, invisible conversation. Reflection: why did shepherds sing to moss? Perhaps the truest answer is that they needed to. Moss was steady, listening without reply, softening the hard stone of their lives. It offered comfort, and song gave that comfort back. It is a reminder that history is not always loud with battles and kings. Sometimes it is very quiet, just a shepherd, a hillside, a moss-covered wall, and a song drifting into the damp Welsh air. And in that quietness, we glimpse something universal: the human need to make meaning, to connect with what surrounds us, to sing even when no one seems to be listening, because maybe, in its slow and silent way, the moss was listening all along. Pajamas beneath the stars, you were to wander through Istanbul in the late 16th century. You might have seen a strange sight. At night, when most citizens were asleep, the tall dome of the Taqi al-Din observatory glowed faintly with lantern light. Inside, men leaned over polished brass instruments, peering through sighting tubes, marking notes, and unfurling scrolls of charts. Nothing unusual, their astronomy had long been a noble science in the Ottoman Empire. What might have surprised you, however, was the clothing. Instead of stiff robes or courtly uniforms, some of the most learned men of the empire were dressed in what we would call pajamas. Soft, cotton garments, loose trousers, and long flowing nightshirts patterned with stripes or stars. They worked not in ceremony, but in comfort. Why? The answer is partly practical, partly cultural, and partly a little bit sleepy. The Ottoman night, the empire, valued time differently than we do. In the Islamic world, the day was punctuated not by mechanical clocks, though they existed, but by the 5 calls to prayer. This meant life bent itself around natural rhythms: dawn, noon, afternoon, dusk, and night. Astronomy was deeply tied to this rhythm. Accurate star charts were needed to determine prayer times, track lunar months, and predict eclipses. Observers often worked through the night when stars were clear, but the Ottoman astronomer was not a knighted gentleman in stiff European attire. He was more like a scholar at home at ease, wrapped in a cotton robe, working in what we'd now call nightwear. The idea of night clothes was not new. The Ottomans, with access to fine cotton and silk, perfected loose garments designed for rest. Striped cotton, geese, and tarsi night tunics and soft trousers were common. A scholar pulling an all-nighter in the observatory might wear exactly what he would to bed, simply because it was practical. Pajamas were study clothes. The observatory as a bedroom of the stars accounts of the Istanbul Observatory of Taki Alden, established in 1577, describe rooms filled with celestial globes, mural quadrants, and long sighting tubes stretching toward the heavens. Yet the atmosphere was not purely scientific, it was also strangely domestic. Scholars would recline on cushions while waiting for the right star to cross the meridian. Tea and coffee were brought in brass pots. Lamps smoked faintly, perfuming the room with olive oil. Some accounts mention slippers scattered near the instruments, as if the astronomers had left their shoes at the door, like polite house guests, in a sense. The observatory was not unlike a giant, open-air bedroom. Instead of sleeping under the stars, the astronomers studied under them. Pajamas made sense. Why sit stiff and uncomfortable when the night demanded patience? Pajamas as a symbol of study to us. Pajamas imply relaxation and dreams. But in the Ottoman scholarly world, loose garments carried another meaning: freedom of the body to free the mind. Restrictive clothing, like the layered ceremonial robes of court, was unsuitable for long hours of writing or calculation. Astronomers, poets, and mathematicians alike often preferred night clothes or study robes. Some even joked that wisdom arrived only when the scholar was dressed for sleep. Pajamas were not laziness, they were a uniform of thought. Imagine a circle of men in striped cotton nightshirts, ink stains on their sleeves, quills scratching on parchment as they mapped Jupiter's moons. It might sound comical, but it was simply normal, cultural quirk or quiet rebellion. Some historians suggest that working in pajamas also carried a quiet message. While European scholars often dressed formally to emphasize dignity, the Ottomans preferred to show that scholarship was part of life itself. You did not need ceremony to measure the stars. You could do it in slippers. It was a philosophy of intimacy with knowledge. Just as one spoke casually with friends at home, one could work casually with the heavens. Pajamas blurred the line between life, rest, and science. The stars were not distant, they were part of your nightly routine. Night watches and drowsy. Calculations, of course. There was also the simple matter of exhaustion. Observations required patience. Hours might pass before a planet aligned with a measuring instrument. Astronomers often dozed between notes, waking to make a quick sketch, then slumping back against cushions. Pajamas were not only comfortable, they were practical for naps. A sleepy observer could rise, jot down the position of Saturn, and collapse back into slumber without ceremony. It was science woven into the rhythms of tired human bodies. And perhaps that is why the legend arose that Ottoman star charts carried occasional ink blots, shaped like drool stains. So, when you imagine Ottoman astronomers, don't picture stiff men in turbans and court robes staring sternly at the heavens. Picture instead a group of scholars in soft night clothes, barefoot or slippered, sipping coffee, yawning occasionally, and tracing the cosmos with quills while the rest of the city slept. The stars were endless. The work was slow. Pajamas made it bearable. Pajamas beneath the stars. You were to wander through Istanbul in the late 16th century. You might have seen a strange sight. At night, when most citizens were asleep, the tall dome of the Taki Aldin Observatory glowed faintly with lantern light. Inside, men leaned over polished brass instruments, peering through sighting tubes, marking notes and unfurling scrolls of charts. Nothing unusual, their astronomy had long been a noble science in the Ottoman Empire. What might have surprised you, however, was the clothing. Instead of stiff robes or courtly uniforms, some of the most learned men of the empire were dressed in what we would call pajamas. Soft cotton garments, loose trousers, and long flowing nightshirts patterned with stripes or stars. They worked not in ceremony, but in comfort. Why? The answer is partly practical, partly cultural, and partly a little bit sleepy. The Ottoman night, the empire valued time differently than we do. By mechanical clocks, though they existed, but by the 5 calls to prayer. This meant life bent itself around natural rhythms. Dawn, noon, afternoon, dusk, and night. Astronomy was deeply tied to this rhythm. Accurate star charts were needed to determine prayer times, track lunar months, and predict eclipses. Observers often worked through the night when stars were clear. But the Ottoman astronomer was not a knighted gentleman in stiff European attire. He was more like a scholar at home at ease, wrapped in a cotton robe, working in what we'd now call nightwear. The idea of nightclothes was not new. The Ottomans, with access to fine cotton and silk, perfected loose garments designed for rest. Striped cotton, geese, intarsi, night tunics, and soft trousers were common. A scholar pulling an all-nighter in the observatory might wear exactly what he would to bed, simply because it was practical. Pajamas were study clothes. The observatory as a bedroom of the stars accounts. Of the Istanbul Observatory, of Teki Aldin, established in 1577, describe rooms filled with celestial globes, mural quadrants, and long sighting tubes stretching toward the heavens. Yet the atmosphere was not purely scientific, it was also strangely domestic. Scholars would recline on cushions while waiting for the right star to cross the meridian. Tea and coffee were brought in brass pots. Lamps smoked faintly, perfuming the room with olive oil. Some accounts mention slippers scattered near the instruments, as if the astronomers had left their shoes at the door like polite house guests. In a sense, the observatory was not unlike a giant open-air bedroom. Instead of sleeping under the stars, the astronomers studied under them. Pajamas made sense. Pajamas as a symbol of study to us. Pajamas imply relaxation and dreams. But in the Ottoman scholarly world, loose garments carried another meaning: freedom of the body to free the mind. Restrictive clothing, like the layered ceremonial robes of court, was unsuitable for long hours of writing or calculation. Astronomers, poets, and mathematicians alike often prefer night clothes or study robes. Some even joked that wisdom arrived only when the scholar was dressed for sleep. Pajamas were not laziness, they were a uniform of thought. Imagine a circle of men in striped cotton nightshirts, ink stains on their sleeves, quills scratching on parchment as they mapped Jupiter's moons. It might sound comical, but it was simply normal. Cultural quirk or quiet rebellion. Some historians suggest that working in pajamas also carried a quiet message. While European scholars often dressed formally to emphasize dignity, the Ottomans preferred to show that scholarship was part of life itself. You did not need ceremony to measure the stars. You could do it in slippers. It was a philosophy of intimacy with knowledge. Just as one spoke casually with friends at home, one could work casually with the heavens. Pajamas blurred the line between life, rest, and science. The stars were not distant. They were part of your nightly routine. Night watches and drowsy calculations, of course. There was also the simple matter of exhaustion. Observations required patience. Hours might pass before a planet aligned with a measuring instrument. Astronomers often dozed between notes, waking to make a quick sketch, then slumping back against cushions. Pajamas were not only comfortable, they were practical for naps. A sleepy observer could rise, jot down the position of Saturn, and collapse back into slumber without ceremony. It was science woven into the rhythms of tired human bodies. And perhaps that is why the legend arose that Ottoman star charts carried occasional ink blots, shaped like drool stains. So, when you imagine Ottoman astronomers, don't picture stiff men in turbans and court robes staring sternly at the heavens. Picture, instead, a group of scholars in soft nightclothes, barefoot or slippered, sipping coffee, yawning occasionally, and tracing the cosmos with quills, while the rest of the city slept. The stars were endless. The work was slow. Pajamas made it bearable. The legacy of pajama astronomy, pajamas in the memory of scholars when the great observatory of Taki, Alden, was demolished in 1580. Much of its delicate brass instruments were broken, scattered, or repurposed into everyday objects. But the memory of the men who worked there did not vanish. Stories spread quietly, passed from one generation of students to another. Did you know? One tutor might whisper to a new pupil that the first men to measure Jupiter in our city were still in their bedclothes. The pajamas became more than clothing. They became a symbol of devotion, proof that these scholars cared more about the heavens than about appearances. While a court official might spend an hour arranging his robe and turban, the astronomer, still wrapped in cotton trousers and loose shirts, sat beneath the stars. In this contrast, people found a gentle moral. Truth prefers comfort over ceremony, pajamas. As a gentle rebellion, there was also, in pajamas, a quiet rebellion. The Ottoman Empire prized formality in court, in ceremonies, even in the marketplace. Robes, kaftans, turbans, and jeweled belts displayed status. But inside the observatory, these layers were stripped away. Scholars became equal young scribes, old masters, mathematicians, and clockmakers, each dressed alike in soft cotton, slippered feet, hair perhaps uncombed. Pajamas leveled rank. In the dim lamplight, no one could tell a vizier's nephew from a humble student. What mattered was the numbers, the angles, the patient lines of ink. In that sense, astronomy in pajamas was quietly democratic. The stars did not care for turbans or jewels. They appeared for anyone willing to wait. Notebook in hand, humor in the margins. Sodomon humorists did not miss the chance to poke fun. In coffee houses, storytellers joked about astronomers who confused stars with lanterns, or who wrote down the position of Venus only to realize they had been measuring the glimmer of their neighbor's candle. The punchline was almost always the same. They should have stayed in bed if they were already in pajamas. One satirical poem describes an absent-minded astronomer who went outside in nightclothes, convinced he had discovered a new constellation. In fact, he had simply looked at the embroidery on his own trousers under lamplight. The jest was affectionate, never cruel. Pajamas made the astronomers approachable, learned men, yes, but also dreamers prone to sleepiness, coffee stains, and scribbles in the margins. Pajamas and poetry, curiously, pajamas also found their way into poetry. Some Ottoman poets wrote verses comparing the night sky to a silken bedspread, the stars to embroidered pearls, and the astronomer to a drowsy lover lying across it. Pajamas were the perfect garment for this metaphor. The clothing of intimacy, relaxation, and vulnerability. One poet wrote, "The scholar counts the stars in his cotton stripes, while the heavens count his yawns." Such verses blurred science and romance, making the pajama-clad astronomer into a figure of gentle comedy and quiet heroism. Pajamas. Beyond Istanbul, the pajama tradition did not stay only in Istanbul. East and North Africa, and with it traveled the stories of the pajama scholars. In Cairo, students at Al-Azhar joked about adopting the nightshirt method of astronomy. In Damascus, travelers told tales of Istanbul's stargazers who dressed as if they were about to nap. Even European visitors took note. Some Venetian merchants, on hearing of Ottoman observatories, brought back reports of scholars who dress like men going to bed, yet who study the heavens more carefully than our best mathematicians. The contrast amused them greatly. In a way, pajamas became a cultural curiosity, a detail that distinguished Ottoman astronomy from other traditions. Pajamas and the philosophy of rest behind all the humor. However, there was a deeper idea. The Ottomans saw rest not as laziness, but as a form of wisdom. To be comfortable was to think clearly. Pajamas embodied this philosophy. Scholarship was not meant to be an exhausting march, but a gentle rhythm: observe, record, rest, dream, observe. Again, this was particularly true in astronomy, where patience was everything. A comet might appear only briefly. A planet might take years to shift in the sky. Pajamas reminded scholars that knowledge was not seized quickly. It was waited for, slowly, in the long comfort of the night. The pajama legacy in modern memory tay. Little survives of the Istanbul Observatory except scattered writings and stories. But the pajama tradition continues in subtle ways. In Turkey, the phrase "working in pajamas" still suggests quiet diligence, not idleness, and in popular retellings, the pajama-wearing astronomers have become almost folkloric figures, half scholar, half dreamer. Imagine a bedtime story. Once, long ago, there were men who measured Saturn while wearing nightshirts, who wrote star maps with coffee-stained hands, and who yawned as often as they calculated. Such an image remains strangely comforting. It suggests that wisdom does not require stiffness or grandeur. Sometimes the greatest truths arrive when one is at ease. Pajamas. As a universal symbol in the end, pajamas are not uniquely Ottoman. Across cultures, scholars, monks, poets, and even inventors often worked in the garments of rest. Chinese scholars wrote poems in robes meant for lounging. Medieval monks kept night habits close to hand when copying texts at dawn. Even modern scientists pulling long hours are known for wearing whatever keeps them most comfortable. The Ottomans simply embraced this openly, making pajamas not a secret indulgence, but a visible part of scholarly life. They turned what was ordinary into something meaningful. Pajamas became the garment of patience, of sleepless nights, of knowledge pursued quietly in the lamplight, closing reflection so. When we remember Ottoman astronomers, we should not picture only brass instruments and golden star charts. We should picture cotton stripes, slippers, and loose sashes. We should imagine yawns, spilled coffee, and faint doodles in the margins of parchment. The stars, patient and eternal, do not mind how we dress when we look at them. Pajamas were simply the Ottoman way of saying, we will meet the heavens as ourselves, comfortable, human, a little sleepy, yet endlessly curious. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson. Knowledge does not always demand armor or robes. Sometimes it only asks for patience, a cup of coffee, and a pair of pajamas. The birth of dream, recording in the Tang nighttime in the Tang Empire, the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, was famous for its poetry, paintings, and bustling cities lit with lanterns. But beneath the brightness of court life lay a quieter fascination. Dreams. Dreams were not treated as random nonsense. They were seen as messages woven with meaning, sometimes from ancestors, sometimes from spirits, sometimes from the restless heart itself. By the 8th century, dreams had become so important that the court sponsored scribes whose job was to record them carefully. These were not just ordinary clerks. They were called dream scribes, men who sat with brushes and silk, waiting for sleepers to wake and describe what they had seen. Silk, as a canvas of sleep paper, existed in the Tang era, but silk remained the preferred surface for delicate or sacred writing. It was smooth, luminous, and enduring. To write a dream on silk was to honor it, treating it as fragile and precious. Silk scrolls were often unrolled at dawn. A dream scribe, sitting cross-legged, would dip his brush into black ink and listen as a scholar, noblewoman, or monk recounted the images of the night. The scribe's task was not to interpret only, to record with precision. Some scrolls show simple notes. A white crane appeared by a river. Others are long, filled with winding descriptions. I walked through 9 gates of jade, then met a child carrying a peach larger than his head. The more vivid the dream, the more carefully the scribe shaped his brushstrokes. Why dreams were written down. Why did the Tang dynasty invest such care in dreams? There were several reasons. Divination dreams were believed to predict the future. If a general dreamed of a broken spear, it might warn of defeat. If an emperor dreamed of golden dragons, it suggested prosperity. Medicine, physicians used dreams to diagnose illnesses. A patient who dreamed often of fire might be said to suffer from an imbalance of heat in the body. Recording dreams gave doctors clues to hidden ailments, philosophy, and poetry. Dreams were seen as reflections of the soul. Poets loved them, using dream records as inspiration for verses. Thus, the silk scrolls were not idle curiosities. They were documents meant to guide lives, armies, and even the empire itself. The work of a dream scribe. Imagine a dream scribe in the Tang court. His night began when others prepared for bed. He arranged brushes, trimmed wicks of lamps, and unrolled lengths of silk across his low desk. When courtiers or nobles awoke in the dark hours, he would be summoned. He had to write swiftly for dreams, faded like mist. His brushstrokes had to be neat but quick, catching words before they dissolved from memory. At times, he scribbled fragments, clouds shaped like horses, voice of mother calling. At other times, he filled entire scrolls before the dreamer's memory faded. The scribe himself was not meant to judge. He did not say, "This dream means fortune," or "That dream is unlucky." His art was silent fidelity. In his careful hand, even the strangest dream gained dignity. The atmosphere of Dream Chamber's dream recording often took place in chambers, specially arranged for sleep. These rooms were lined with silk curtains, perfumed with incense, and warmed by braziers. Gentle music flutes or zithers might play to ease the sleeper into vivid visions. The scribe sat quietly nearby, half in shadow, brush ready. He was like a guardian of the threshold between worlds. His presence reassured the dreamer that nothing seen in sleep would be lost. In the hush of these rooms, time seemed to bend. Outside, roosters crowed and carts rattled in the streets. Inside, a scribe wrote down images of moonlit palaces, flying tigers, and vanished ancestors. A dream saved in silk one surviving fragment. Attributed to the Tang, reads simply, "I dreamed of walking across a bridge woven of rainbows. At the center was a woman with no face. She gave me a mirror, but in it was the sky. It is unclear whose dream this was or why it was recorded, but its survival shows the seriousness with which the Tempt treated such visions. Without the dream scribe, it would have vanished into the silence of dawn. The prestige of dream records, to own a dream scroll, was a mark of refinement. Just as wealthy families collected poetry or calligraphy, they sometimes collected their dreams. A nobleman might keep a chest of silk strips describing the night visions of his household. A monk might keep records of his students' dreams as part of spiritual training. Some scrolls were even gifted, tied with ribbons, as tokens of intimacy. To give someone your dream was to share the deepest part of yourself, began the tradition of the Tang Dynasty sleep scribes, quiet men with brushes. Sitting through the night, turning fleeting visions into lines of ink on silk, they gave dreams. A body so they could travel through time from one dawn to another. Their work was at once humble and profound. They did not speak, they did not judge, they only wrote. Yet, in doing so, they preserved the sleeping imagination of an empire. The ritual of recording dreams by the height of the Tang Dynasty, dream recording had grown into a formal ritual. It was no longer just a matter of scribes sitting nearby. Entire households, monasteries, and even small government offices had their own structured ways of capturing dreams. A typical morning ritual began at dawn. The dreamer, often still wrapped in sleepiness, would sit upright on a cushion. The scribe would bow, unroll a prepared strip of silk, and set his inkstone with water first. The dreamer would recite a prayer. May the fleeting images of night remain as clear as dawn's first light. This was less about religion and more about focusing memory. Only then would the dreamer begin describing. The scribe's brush flowed in silence. Each word was rendered with care, not only for accuracy, but for aesthetic grace. Tang culture held that how one recorded a dream mattered almost as much as the dream itself. A dream of chaos, if written beautifully, was thought to soothe the heart. The silk measurement. Why silk? Beyond its beauty, silk was believed to measure the length of dreams. A short, fleeting dream might take only a few inches of fabric. A great, sprawling vision could cover an entire scroll. Thus, silk was not merely a surface, it was a yardstick of the unconscious. Scholars began to compare dreams by their physical length. The general's dream was 3 feet of silk. The monk's dream was 5. In this way, dreams gained a tangible weight. They were not whispers or shadows, but physical objects rolled up, tied with cord, and stored in lacquered boxes. To unfurl, one was to re-enter the dream itself. Dreams as state business, the Tang court. Dreams were sometimes read alongside official reports. A minister might present not only tax records and military news, but also the emperor's dream from the night before. For example, if the emperor dreamed of floods, officials might debate whether the yellow river dikes needed repair. If he dreamed of drought, prayers for rain were ordered. Thus, The work of dream scribes could ripple outward into real decisions, engineering projects, military campaigns, even new rituals at temples. A dream of dragons could change the calendar. A dream of crows could move armies. The dream guilds, because demand grew. Scribes began forming loose guilds. These were not grand institutions, but networks of specialists who trained younger. Writers in the art of recording. A novice learned how to sit quietly, how to keep his eyes lowered, how never to yawn when a noble described a dream of flying peaches for the 4th time. He practiced calligraphy endlessly, for a shaky hand would dishonor a sacred vision. Some guilds even had secret techniques, special strokes to capture odd sounds, ways of spacing to show pauses in memory. To read one guild's scroll was to see not just the dream, but the signature style of the scribe. Dreams and medicine-tongue physicians consulted dream scrolls as carefully as they did a patient's pulse. If a man dreamed repeatedly of thirst, it suggested dryness in the body. If a woman dreamed of snakes, it hinted at blocked energy. Doctors sometimes prescribed herbs, not after touching the body, but after reading silk. To modern minds, this seems fanciful, but in Tang thought, the boundary between dream and health was thin. To heal one was to heal the other. The scrolls thus became medical documents, woven of both imagination and diagnosis. Dreams as literature was inevitable that poets began stealing from dream scrolls. Tang poetry already loved twilight, mountains, and moonlight. But now, dream imagery entered verse. A court poet might borrow a line, a mirror filled with sky. Another might shape a couplet from a scribe's record. Last night I walked across a bridge of rainbows. Today my heart still trembles with its colors. Some dream scrolls became so admired that they circulated like books. People read them not for prophecy, but for pleasure. The sheer strangeness of the sleeping mind preserved in brush and silk. An example from a monk's dream tells of wandering. Monk's recorded dream tells of wandering into a forest where the trees were made of bells. Each step rang out, yet the sound made no noise outside the dream. In the dream, he sat down beneath the largest bell tree, and when he awoke, he believed it was a message to meditate more deeply in silence. The scribe who wrote this dream was not remembered, but his work preserved the vision for centuries without his brush. The soundless bells would never have rung again. The silence of the scribes, despite their importance. Scribes themselves remained invisible. Their names rarely appear. They were trained to efface the self. To intrude upon a dream with one's own interpretation was considered arrogance. Thus, dream scribe was both present and absent like a shadow in the lamplight, recording other people's souls while keeping his own hidden dots. So, the practice of dream scribes deepened. What began as private curiosity became ritual, medicine, literature, and politics. Silk scrolls stretched longer, guilds grew, and dreams slowly entered the bloodstream of Tang life. The empire dreamed, and the scribes measured those dreams not with rulers or clocks, but with brushstrokes across silk. The afterlife of dreams when the Tang dynasty began to fade. Its dream scrolls did not disappear. Instead, they traveled sometimes across provinces, sometimes across centuries. Monks carried them in bundles as they moved between temples. Courtiers tucked them away in trunks that survived wars and fires. A few found their way into libraries, where they slept as quietly as the dreams they recorded. Later, dynasties, the Song, the Yuan, the Ming sometimes mocked the Tang habit of writing down every dream. A stern song scholar once wrote, "Dreams are but smoke. Why write smoke upon silk?" Yet even he admitted that Tang scrolls had value, if only because they captured a way of seeing the mind. To read one was to peer not just into another person's night, but into an era when imagination was treated with respect. The scholar, who read only dreams, one tale tells of a retired Tang official who abandoned his duties and dedicated his last 20 years to nothing but reading dream scrolls. He lived in a small house in the mountains, surrounded by shelves of rolled silk. Visitors described him sitting with a scroll unrolled across his lap, nodding slowly as if in conversation with the dreamer. Sometimes he laughed at an odd vision of flying chickens. Sometimes he wept at the dream of a widow who saw her husband return for one night. He never wrote his own book, but those who met him said his face glowed with calm. To live among other people's dreams, it seems, was to live in a softened world. The vanishing of the guilds by the Ming era. The professional scribes had vanished. Printing presses made paper abundant and cheap, and silk scrolls became too costly for common use. People still told their dreams, but they were scribbled in notebooks or recited to fortune tellers, not brushed onto silk. The guilds dissolved. Apprentices found other work. The quiet art of recording another person's night faded as arts sometimes do, not with scandal, but with silence. Yet a few scrolls remained, tucked away in temple storehouses and family chests. They were no longer practical records, but heirlooms, cherished for their strangeness. A glimpse at surviving scrolls today. In rare cases, scholars unroll tanged dream scrolls preserved in museums. The silk may be frayed, the ink faded, yet the words still speak. One scroll describes a farmer dreaming of a mountain made of rice. Another tells of a scholar who met Confucius in his sleep, only for the sage to ask him the price of cabbage. Another records a young girl's dream of a cat who scolded her for forgetting to feed it. The handwriting is delicate, each brushstroke trembling slightly, as though aware it was carrying something ephemeral. The scrolls are not majestic in the taste, way of battle records or imperial decrees, but they are intimate soft lanterns of memory from more than 1,000 years ago. Dreams. Beyond borders, there is evidence that stories of Tang dream scribes traveled abroad. Japanese monks visiting China wrote about them, and fragments of the practice appeared in Heian Japan's fascination with court diaries and poetic dreams. In Central Asia, merchants passing along the Silk Roads may have carried tales of emperors, guided by visions. Though the silk itself rarely traveled so far, the idea of measuring dreams did. And like many ideas, it changed shape wherever it landed. What dreams teach without meaning, the Tang scribes did not always search for hidden meanings. Sometimes a dream was recorded simply because it was beautiful, or odd, or moving. A dream of a lantern that floated into the clouds. A dream of a bridge made of fish. A dream of a mother who returned only to hand her child a peach, then vanished again. These were not prophecies, nor medical charts, nor state secrets. They were simply dreams, preserved because someone thought they mattered. The smallest flicker of imagination deserves, cares perhaps the most enduring legacy of the scribes. The quiet legacy, though the guilds dissolved and the scrolls faded. The spirit of the Tang dream scribes lingers. Modern scholars of Chinese literature still speak of how Tang poets blurred the line between waking and dreaming. Artists still draw inspiration from the floating imagery of old dream records, and, in a way, the very act of writing down one's dream in a diary today is a faint echo of those silk scrolls. We no longer measure our visions in feet of fabric, but the desire to hold on to something fleeting remains unchanged. The symbol of silket is fitting that silk. The fabric that once traveled the world as China's most precious trade good also carried the most delicate cargo of all, the fragile world of dreams. Silk was durable enough to last centuries, yet soft enough to mirror the drifting shapes of sleep. To unroll a dream scroll is to hold both strength and fragility in one's hands, like a dream itself, closing reflections so. The Tang dream scribes fade into history. They left no monuments, no armies, no great victories. Their legacy is quiet. Rolls of silk filled with clouds, dragons, peaches, rivers, cats. And stars dot, their work reminds us that history is not only about wars and rulers. It is also about the inner lives of ordinary people, their longings, their night wanderings. A dream written on silk may not stop a flood or win a battle, but it shows us that even in the grandest of dynasties, people valued the gentle, strange, and fleeting stories that visited them in sleep, and perhaps in reading of them now. We become a little like those scribes, ourselves preserving the delicate, ephemeral world of imagination and letting it drift softly into the quiet of the night.